Welcome to this session from High Level Coder, and in this session I'm going to explain what is an ideal layered code-based structure for a Spring Boot application. And for that matter, we can actually take inspiration from this video and understand that any specific framework, any specific application needs to have a layered code-based structure. And what is the reason for that? Like, say for example, if we have a bookshelf at our home, we definitely organize books logically in different shelves, like maybe some books of fiction in one shelf and some books of comedy in another shelf and some books related to some crime thrillers in another shelf. Similarly, if you look at maybe a store which sells different kinds of apparels, different kinds of garments, then also you will see that there are different sections in the store where there are different kinds of garments. So there are different sections, dedicated sections for trousers, there are dedicated sections for shirts, and so on and so forth. So all what I'm trying to say is so there is always a logical segregation for a better management of resource. Similarly, also in our code base, we need to have a very logical segregation, but we need to understand what should be the basis for logical segregation. We just cannot have a logical segregation whatever we like, because that might not be beneficial. In a code base, we basically segregate the code base into different folders or into different layers based on what that part of the code is doing. So in a typical Spring Boot project, we divide the project into different layers, like into different subfolders or layers, like controller, or then service, then database access objects abbreviated as DAO, and then maybe models. There can be also other folders. And why we segregate them into this kind of subfolders? Because we want to have a complete separation of concern. We want to have a single responsibility for each layer. We will talk more about that. We will discuss more about that in the subsequent portion of this video. But before I go there, let me make a quick humble request to you. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, but you like my explanation in video, I request you to go ahead and subscribe to my channel and take a moment to view my other videos and provide me feedback. And also please share my videos with your other friends who you think might be benefited from this, because that's going to motivate me further to produce quality content. Okay, so let's proceed to see what are the different layers in a Spring Boot application, like controller layer, DAO layer, service layer, and what are the purpose of every single layer. Like first we will see the controller layer, which is the entry point of a Spring Boot application. So this is the layer where the Spring Boot framework intercepts the HTTP request and then delegates the HTTP request to a specific method here. So this layer is responsible for receiving the HTTP request, extracting whatever from the path of the request or from the query parameter, and then sends the request to the next layer, and when the response comes back, then it is responsible for sending the response back to the client. So all this layer should be doing is dealing with that HTTP request and preparing the HTTP response, because the HTTP response also needs to have two parts. One is the status code, whether it's a OK HTTP response, which is HTTP 200, or it's not a OK response, and also then the body of the response. So the controller layer should solely be responsible of dealing with the request and the response. Controller layer should not be bothered about the logic that should be implemented in actually serving the request. Okay, so that is the purpose of controller layer. Controller layer is for handling the request and preparing the response. Now service layer, so the controller layer delegates the call ideally to the service layer. So that is why you will see that in Spring Boot we have an instance of a service layer object always injected within the controller layer, because the controller layer calls the next layer, which is the service layer. And what does the service layer contain? The service layer contains the actual business logic. Maybe in my service, I need to pull in data from multiple sources, and then I need to compare the data from multiple sources and then refine the data and then actually send the response back. So whatever I need to do based on the business logic, maybe I need to do some calculation based on the data and then send the response. So the core business logic should reside in the service layer. The service layer does not need to know the request does not need to know the response, or rather should not know the request or the response, and should not also know about where the data is coming from. Like the data may be coming from a database, the data may be coming from a different service, the data may be coming from a file system and whatnot. But the service layer is not bothered about that. The service layer is about basically implementing the core business logic. So once it receives the request, then it calls the next data layer, and then once it receives the response from the data layer, it actually processes the response, it refines the response, it applies the business logic, and then it sends back the response. If there is any kind of pagination, that is also implemented in the service layer. And pagination is very important, because if there is too much of response, then that is going to overwhelm both the client and the server. So the service layer should always take care of pagination by default, even if the client has not requested for paginated resource. And then comes the DAO layer. The DAO layer is responsible for interacting with whatever data store I have. It may be a relational database like Oracle, MySQL. It may be a NoSQL like MongoDB. It may be a file system. It may be an external service. Or it may be an in-memory data store as well. So whatever the case is, the DAO layer, also known as the data access object layer, is responsible for retrieving the data. So if, say for example, I change my implementation from MongoDB to MySQL, only my DAO layer should be impacted, and neither service layer nor controller layer should be impacted. So that's it. I hope you got an understanding of the layered architecture of Spring Boot, the controller, service, and the DAO layer. You can also have more layers, but these are the three primary layers that any application should have. The controller layer, again, responsible for only handling the request and the response without even being bothered about where the response is coming from a database or from a file system or from an external service. The controller is not bothered about that. The service layer is bothered about only implementing the actual business logic, and the database access layer is bothered about retrieving the data from the specific database instance, from the specific backend. So that's it. I hope the session was useful, and again I would make that humble request that if you like my session, like my explanation, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and also take your time to watch my other videos. Maybe they would be useful to you, and provide me feedback, and also please share the videos with your other friends so that it would motivate me to produce quality videos. Thank you again.